Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us in this Hebrew word study today. I'm very appreciative of everyone who takes the time to listen to this. Again, I'm praying that it is a blessing into your life and that these studies of God's word and the understanding that can be gained through the Hebrew language has been such a blessing to me. And my goal is that you will catch on to that too, and that'll be a blessing in your life. So again, very humbled and thankful that you take the time to listen to this class. We are in 1 Samuel chapter 18, and we're continuing in this interesting narrative of David having just slain Goliath and being welcomed into the fold, if you will, of Saul and his family. And last week we looked at the instant friendship, that bond that was formed between Saul's son Jonathan and David. And so we're going to continue with that as we go into chapter 18 and go to verse 2. It said that Saul would not let David go back to his home, and that David lived at I don't know if it was a palace or what kind of house. Obviously, the temple didn't exist yet. They were living in tents, still conquering the land. They had homes and cities, but none of this has been centralized. Jerusalem was not yet in the control of the Israelites, neither was Bethlehem. They're still working on conquering all of these. So it'd be interesting, it's not a palace as we think of it, or a fortified city that they're living behind. This is still prior to all of that. None of that really happens until David becomes king, and then more when Solomon becomes king and erects the tabernacle. So I'm not quite sure where they are living, but wherever it is, Saul is keeping David by him. And so we see this situation, this friendship that exists between Jonathan and David. And there's some very interesting words here in chapter 3 that, again, the English just doesn't do it justice. So it's Vayikrot, Yonatan LeDavid Berit. Now, if you studied any Hebrew at all, you will know one of the first words that you learn is Berit, and that's the word for covenant, used many, many times throughout the Bible. But what is missing here that makes this such a great study is the word that's translated "and made" is vayikrot, which the root word is in it is the word katav, which is to cut. And so many of you are going to say, or karath, excuse me, which is related to katav, which is to cut. And so what does cutting have to do with making a covenant? And this is where the beauty of where covenants came from, and relationships were based upon these covenants, and the relationship with God was based upon these covenants that were made. And so we're going to see here that the root for covenant really has to do with cutting of an animal and cutting it in half. And one of the first things we notice there is used when Abraham makes a covenant with God, and he divides his sacrifices in that kind of a spooky little story of the smoking furnace and a burning lamp, and the horror of a dark night falls upon Abraham. But it's during this time that we see that this is where covenants are made, in the cutting of the animals and this distribution of them, starting with what was known in the covenant between Abraham and God, but then also carried over that when people would get together, they would slay an animal, they would cut the animal, and it would become their meal. And it was during this meal that they would make this agreement or this covenant, again, dinner table diplomacy, if you will, of getting together, sharing a meal, Again, times have not changed. We still do this. If you want to get to know someone, if you want to make a business deal, it's very often that you will go to dinner together or have a meal together. And this is where this root word comes from, of sharing a meal and making this covenant. And so it's very, very interesting that this word, it just says "and made," but it uses the word to cut and to eat this sacrifice. And so Jonathan and David are entering into this covenant. What I find interesting is there's nothing explaining what this covenant was all about. We see it as a friendship, but it implies that there's something a little more here. There's some understanding that's being exchanged, that we can see the effect of it later on, as their relationship plays out and how they interact with one another, and we can surmise what kind of covenant they made together. But the scriptures don't tell us exactly what the terms of this covenant was, but we know that it was a covenant based upon a great friendship, based upon a great love, as we see in the rest of verse 3. And that this friendship was very, very deep. I believe also it was during this time that Jonathan had a very good spiritual insight into David's relationship with God, and where David was going to go and how God was going to use him. Again, Jonathan wasn't there when um, Samuel came and anointed David in the presence of the sons of Jesse and Jesse himself. But we have to really believe that David and Jonathan talked about this, and that Jonathan, seeing how God used David to fight Goliath, how God anointed David through the hands of Samuel, Jonathan had to have known this. And the character of Jonathan shines through in what we see here, is that Jonathan, being Saul's son, if they were to follow in the traditions of all other kingdoms that existed upon that time, a dynasty was normally created, and that the kingship was passed from father to eldest son, and it would continue in that way. And that's the way all previous kingdoms were established. Well, we're going to see here that God's kingdom is very different, and Jonathan would have been the next king. And so we're going to see that I believe he understood that God was working through David, and that David would be the next king. And we see that in Jonathan's actions here in verse 4, that he takes his robe. Now, the word for robe is really fascinating. Again, you wouldn't know it if you weren't studying the Hebrew, but with the tools that we have, we can just do this little click on here and opens up the word for robe. And okay, doesn't give us anything earth-shaking. It just said that it's a robe. It's a me'il, but it has a word origin. And when something has a meaning, we want to see where it comes from. So you notice when we hover over the ma'al, it flashes showing us it's a hyperlink. So we click on ma'al, it takes us to the Hebrew word 4603, and we see something that doesn't look anything like robe. The ma'al means to act unfaithfully or treacherously. And of course, if something like this doesn't pique your interest, I don't know what will, because you got to put together the pieces here as to how does robe, where the word robe come from, and how does it relate to its root word, meaning to act unfaithfully or treacherously. And so we think about, what is a robe? That a robe covers something up. It's a protection, yes, but it also is covering something that's more valuable. In the case of a person, it's covering, their private parts. It's covering things that they don't want the world to see. It's a cloak. We use that word cloak with the thought that it is something that's somewhat hidden. And so the word for robe actually comes from this root meaning to act unfaithfully or treacherously, but the purpose behind it is to cover something that you don't want someone to see, is to hide something. And so I think that is really kind of cool, to find that root word. And just to take it just a little bit further, we're going to look into some of the other lexicons, which is like a dictionary that exists. The first one is the Jastro's Dictionary of the Targumim. These are a dictionary of the Aramaic, by which the Hebrew and Aramaic are somewhat sister languages. The Aramaic sometimes gives us a earlier look at the origin of the word. And so I've gone ahead and for sake of time, look this up and put it on a page, and we see the word mem ayin lamed, which is the ma'al, and it uses the word of to pretty much supports the cloaking. It is covering up, but it also talks about faithlessness, which I thought was kind of interesting. And so when you think of that, of covering up, many times our faith is difficult to see. We cannot read the faith of ourselves or of other people by some meter or some number that tells us what our level of faith is, but yet it is hidden inside. And interesting to see that that word ma'al, with being robed and being clothed and being cloaked, also has a relationship to a lack of faith, or having someone who says they have faith, but it's hidden inside and never makes its way to the outside um, to be seen. I'm going to look at another one of my favorite lexicons, and this is the one by Gesenius, of Hebrew and Chaldean. We look under Ma'al, and again, it talks about to act treacherously or be faithless, do something by stealth. Okay, so you got that understanding. Let's go back and really apply it to this word for robe, because what does Jonathan do with this robe that he has? This was probably, you'll find some Bibles will translate it as armor. Um, Others will say it's the robe that's underneath the armor. Maybe it's the robe that's on top of the armor. We really don't know. This may have been a robe that was significant of his position in the kingdom, that identified him as King Saul's son, very similar to the coat of many colors that was given to Joseph to signify by his father that he was a special child. And so it's very significant here that Jonathan removes this robe, gives it to David. In the deeper sense, it's showing that Jonathan is acknowledging David's rightful position in God's eyes to be king, and that Jonathan is submitting himself to it and humbling himself and giving up his right to be king. So again, that's very, very, very cool. Then we get to the next word of Umadav, which is the H4055, and it talks about his armor. And again, the armor that we look at back then, here it really doesn't say armor. It says something that's measured, or a cloth garment. And you wonder, well, how did they get armor out of this? And what we have to remember is that metallurgy was in its infancy at that time. Yes, they had the ability to have brass and bronze and iron, but yet the way that they were, and of course working with gold and silver, but in the case of battle type instruments, they would have stayed with brass and iron, but yet they didn't have the ability to form it in ways that we have, or that we picture. When we think of armor, we immediately go to the Middle Ages of Europe, and we think of the knights in shining armor and these coats of mail and coats of armor that the knights would wear. This did not exist back at this time. They maybe had a helmet, as Goliath did, that was maybe of brass, but more likely the armor that they wore were like heavy leather scales or shingles, and of course, not a lot of this has survived through the millennium, because it's deteriorates with time, but pictures they have found show this to be thick pieces of leather that are sewn on top of one another to give it many, many layers. The leather would become hard. It would provide resistance to um, arrows and spears passing through, and that was as good as it gets. Maybe some of them experimented with strips of um, metal on top of these, but again, you have to deal with the weight of this, which is maybe why you know this whole thing of armor and David wearing the armor of Saul didn't work out. Again, this is not elegant armor by any means. And so we see that Jonathan took off his armor and his sword and his bow and his belt and gave it to David. Again, more symbolic than it is realistic, because we don't see that David ever uses any of these in the future. When he has his exploits and goes into his battle, we do see that he used Goliath's sword at one time, but he seemed to use his own armament. And I'm sure Jonathan, with the battles that he's about to fight, would definitely not be out on the battlefield without all his armament. So this is a very symbolic verse here, showing that Jonathan was just submitting himself to the will of God, and that this great friendship that Jonathan and David had transcended all of the royal titles. It transcended whatever future Jonathan thought he could have in a kingly kingdom, and that he was really wanting the will of God to be done through who is now his best friend, David. So again, thank you for joining with us. We didn't cover too much ground, but we'll pick up on it next week. And I pray that you can see the beauty of being able to study these Hebrew words. And please don't get overwhelmed by it or think that this is something of a necessity. Just keep following it. Eventually, it'll start to make sense. And someday, this may be a real blessing into your life as you search out these words on your own. So God bless you all. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.